Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on client returns and credits in ProCloud. My name is Brad, and I'll be hosting the demonstration today. If you have questions during the webinar, feel free to enter them into the questions pane on your GoToWebinar panel. If the question is outside of the scope of today's discussion, please email them to support@designmanager.com. And lastly, if you miss a portion of today's webinar or want to review any of our past discussions, go to our YouTube channel at Design Manager Inc., Design Manager INC. And here you can see all sorts of topics, including our quick start videos, short helpful tutorials, and then all of our comprehensive webinars, which we categorize into our project management and accounting courses, along with all of our other weekly webinars as well. So let's get started. When handling client returns and credits, the first and most important step is to fully grasp your client's expectation of the return and exactly what you're intending to do, independent of Design Manager. What's the client's desire? Do they want a check back? Do they want a credit on account? Do they want the funds moved from a retainer to an invoice? Whatever. Having this clear notion of what you're trying to accomplish is critical in properly implementing the transactions in ProCloud, and it really would be necessary if you're going to contact our client experience team for help as well. Knowing exactly what the client is trying to accomplish, is the client's desire, is the real key. In today's discussions, we're going to be heavily utilizing the client returns and credits window, which can handle the vast majority of such processes with really great ease and accuracy. And you can find that on your accounting tab in the accounts receivable frame, and you can see the returns and credits button. And there's the window. And again, we'll be coming here time and time again. You will notice under the accounts payable frame, there's also a returns and credits. That is for your vendors. They have a smaller, yet also a very helpful returns and credits window. Now, if you want some more information on vendor returns and credits, well, guess what? Go to our YouTube channel, our advanced accounting for vendor returns and credits. We go through all of those processes there as well. So you can review that at your leisure. Let's begin with some common scenarios of reallocating or returning funds to the client, beginning with retainers. If you have any questions about recording a retainer or its corresponding cousin, the deposit on a proposal, which will be discussed next, please review another of our webinars, and this one is Accounting Course 1, Client Deposits and Retainers. And that's a very in-depth discussion on those two critical transactions. So tons of information on that YouTube channel. Okay, retainers. Retainers are funds received from the client to allow you to begin purchasing goods or services. They can essentially be considered a good faith covenant between your company and the client, really to ensure payment at the upon the finished design services, or simply an unallocated source of capital to begin purchasing. Sometimes the retainer actually becomes the design fee as well. We've seen it all. Our team routinely receives questions on applying, reallocating, or refunding retainers, particularly at the end of the project. So let's highlight some of those scenarios. One of the most common and convenient ways to utilize a client's retainer at the end of the project would simply to apply it to when you're creating one of the final invoices. So let's take one of our projects, our coastal cottage, and imagine it's nearing the end of its design phase, and we're going to be invoicing all of the finalized goods and services. I'm going to jump over to our project tab, and I'm going to use our project status window, which is a very convenient way to monitor how we're going to be affecting some of our transactions. So looking at our project status window for our coastal college, we can see that we have both a retainer received of $12,500, and we've received some deposits as well. The total amount of the two of those, and yet our total deposit retainer applied is zero. We've used none of those funds yet, and that corresponds also under client invoice frame here as well, where we can see we've utilized none of those. The deposit and retainer tab shows those transactions in detail. We can see our initial retainer of $12,500, and then we actually have two deposits, one on proposal 1 and one on proposal 2. So how do we actually utilize this retainer on the invoice? Very, very easily. So first, we're going to go to our accounting tab. And as you can imagine, we're going to go to our client invoices window. Let's go ahead and add an invoice. Pop in our coastal cottage, and we can see all of our items populate for us. Now, let's leave the day's date is just fine. The transaction description, how about we say something creative like final invoice? And if I begin selecting items or tagging them as we call it, notice when I select the star pillow, my totals recalculate for me, including the deposit. Deposits get utilized on the invoice automatically for us. While the retainer, that field is open. We can actually enter that in as desired. And conveniently, the available retainer is shown right on the window for us. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of our items, use my tag function, tag all, great. Design Manager will do all the hard work for me, selecting all of our items. And we can see our total invoice price, tax, all of our deposit, which matches our project status window, and our current balance due. Now, I can go ahead and utilize as much of that retainer as I choose. I will, however, be sternly warned if I try to use more retainer than what's available. So if I try to put in 20,000 upon clicking OK to process the invoice, Design Manager is going to alert me, hey, the total amount of available retainer and deposit is 18,678 and change. You can go ahead and print the very convenient deposit analysis report to analyze this if you think that's incorrect. So I'm going to acknowledge that, and I'm going to correct my retainer. We'll go ahead and use that full 12,500. And as I'm typing, you can see the balance automatically recalculates as well. And now when I click OK, I will not be such sternly warned, and I'll have my invoice on our new invoices tab. And there it is. And we can see the retainer and the deposits are all being sort of blended together as a single sum, reducing the balance due. And let's go ahead and take a look at our invoice. We'll click our post button. We could go right ahead and accept them if so desired, but let's preview it. Modern format is my favorite. And there we go, coming up in my Chrome browser. I'm going to jump right down to the bottom. In our totals region, we can see our entire invoice. There's our freight, sales tax, total invoice amount, and our retainer and deposits are being blended together to reduce a very simple, easy to read balance due for the client. Let's go ahead and accept. And now we'll actually be utilizing both those retainers and all of the deposits themselves. Our invoice is going to drop off of our new tab. There it goes, and we can see it listed on our existing tab. So now let's go examine what actually transpired. And jump back to our projects window. Let's take a look at that status tab, a status window again. Now, our retainers received and deposits received, well, they don't change. We actually got those funds. What does change is the amount that's been applied and our available amount. 0, we've used them all. And that corresponds over in our client invoices frame as well. We can see that's increased tremendously. We can see the application of all of those deposits and retainers and our current balance due for the client. Likewise, on the more detailed tabs, we can see, hey, where did all the transactions go? Well, I'm only showing open transactions. All of those transactions are quote unquote closed because they've been utilized. If I uncheck that option, we can again see our deposits and retainers, but they are now been closed or fully applied to an invoice. And on our invoices tab, we can see our invoices listed here as well with the current AR balance, etc. Lots of information available on this window, as you can imagine. Now, if at a later time it becomes necessary to credit or reverse this invoice, oops, client calls, hey, don't use that retainer. Okay, no problem. We can credit the invoice and ProCloud is going to automatically return or restore that retainer and the deposits for future use. So I'm going to use my handy Go To button, which is going to jump us right over to our client invoices window positioned to that particular invoice. And I'm going to credit our invoice by using the credit button. I'll use the same fiscal month and today's date, transaction description, do not apply retainer. The hide on reports, that would prevent both the invoice and its credit from appearing on some of the client-facing reports, like the statement, client account inquiry, etc. If we click OK, as many of you know, we're going to immediately process the credit invoice. I'm actually going to generate a credit memo. There it is, which is a full reversal of the original invoice. And you can see they're mirrors of one another. If you look out a little bit on our Client Invoices Existing tab, you can see that the original one was credited, and the credit refers to its parent, its cousin, the original invoice as well. So you can always tell if an invoice was credited, and if a credit memo exists, which invoice did it credit. And we can go ahead and reprint that if desired, and we can see, as you would imagine, an absolute reversal of all of the information, including all of our retainer and deposit. And we could pass this on to the client, of course. Okay, now back on our status window, we can see we've basically returned everything to its original state. Yes, we still have our retainer received and our deposits received, but there's no longer any being applied or allocated to the invoices, so they're all available again. And all of the invoice information has been reduced to the original state. On our detailed tabs, we now see all of our transactions, including the retainer and deposits, are actually open. So no matter which option I choose, they're all going to be listed. And on our invoices tab, right now, I'm only seeing invoice 10,025, which still has a balance due. Why? Because again, I have the show open option selected, and my invoice and its credit are technically closed and would only be shown if I uncheck the show open option there. So that retainer is really flexible. It can be used in any manner, apply it on an invoice, amongst other things, and Design Manager will reallocate it back if you ever need to reverse the information that you've done so far. Okay. Now, let's imagine that all of the necessary items in a project have already been invoiced. Or actually at any time, quite honestly, that you yourself or the client desires, you can apply a retainer to a client invoice as a payment. So you can reallocate that retainer yourself and actually move those funds around. Now, since we just credited our Coastal Cottage invoice and returned the retainer, let's stick with that project. So we're going to take a portion of our retainer and let's use it to close our outstanding invoice 10,025. Whenever we're discussing reallocation of funds or moving monies within a project from a retainer to a payment on invoice like we're going to do, or a retainer to a deposit, it's all done in the exact same manner. On your accounting tab in your accounts receivable frame, this is done via the cash receipts window. On our cash receipts window, I'm going to click add. And we'll jump over to our Coastal Cottage. I could put in the project. If a client has multiple projects, you could even do this between projects as well. Now, very first thing, the amount is going to be zero. We're not receiving any funds. We're just reallocating how they're currently being used. So I'm going to input 0 into the amount. Today's date is just fine, but you could change that, of course. My payment type, I'm going to use cash, just so I can have an area with my check number to put a little bit of information in there, and you'll see why momentarily. I'm going to put in apply retainer, and I'll even change my deposit slip number to retain. To reallocate those funds is very, very easy. I can see my first line on my deposit and retainer grid is the retainer itself, and I can see what's been received to date and the total amount available. To reallocate it, I'm going to use the edit button as indicated by the pencil, and I'm going to input the amount that I want to move as indicated by a negative value. So if we want to move 625.95, I'm going to put in a negative 625.95. I'm going to put in an optional transaction description so I have a perfect record of what I was actually trying to accomplish. Let's say pay invoice 10025. Click OK, and ProCloud automatically tags or selects that for me, and we can see it being accumulated or summated in our total region in the bottom left. Now I want to tell ProCloud, where is that 625.95 going? Well, in our case, very simple. It's going to be allocated to invoice 10,025, and we convey that simply by tagging that invoice. And now we can see a total payment being listed as well. Our receipt matches our amount with a difference of 0. I am going to edit the payment transaction on the invoice as well, again, just to have another transaction description for myself for my records from the retainer. And there we go. Negative retainer, I'm robbing the retainer to pay off the invoice. Click OK, and we're going to see a single cash receipt with two offsetting distributions, a negative retainer as indicated by the parentheses, and a positive payment on the invoice. Go ahead and post to execute those transactions, and we're done. Now, of course, we'll see that on the existing tab as a single line along the top, and it has two distributions along the bottom, again, the negative retainer and the positive payment on the invoice. So what else occurred? Well, back on our familiar status window now, we can see our retainer received reduced, because quite honestly, we've taken a portion of that retainer and used it elsewhere. And now our available amount has reduced, and yet our invoicing frame shows that the invoice has been paid in full, and now we no longer have any AR balance with the client. On our detail tabs, we can see that retainer being applied, reducing the overall available amount. And likewise on the invoices tab, well, now there are none open. Why? Because our original invoice and the credit are closed, and now invoice 10,025 is closed as well. And from here, I could again use my go-to, and perhaps I want to reprint this invoice, and I can automatically show that it's including the payments along the bottom for documentation to the client. All very simple, all very similar functionality as we're moving funds around. Okay, lastly, let's imagine that the client wants the retainer returned as it was not fully used, perhaps the scope of the project changed or what have you. Now we can use our returns and credits window to easily generate a free refund. So let's imagine that the client simply wants a check back for the remaining retainer on the bed and breakfast project. So let's close out a few of these. We'll stay on our accounting tab, and there's our returns and credits as we saw at the beginning of the discussion. This window is intended to be as easy to use as possible. All of the information we need to convey is being asked from us. First, what's the project? Well, let's put in our Southwest Bed and Breakfast. The window automatically fills in with an item grid of all of the items that have any available amount to refund. The refund for, are we refunding an item that has a deposit on it or an invoice? No, we're refunding a retainer. And when I select that, you can see the window simplifies to a great deal. Retainers aren't allocated down to the item level. It's a full set of money, so there's less selection needed. Refund type, and there are 4, and here's what they all indicate. Write a check back to the client. Fairly self-explanatory. We're going to remove that retainer from the client's available amount and ultimately generate an invoice from which we can generate a check to the client. In a similar vein, refund it on the client's credit card or ACH. And if you have your Stripe account associated or linked to your design manager, it would actually process through Stripe as well, making your bookkeeping easier, accurate, all of that. 2 others. On account, open AR. Basically, in that case, you'd be creating a manual credit invoice, a manual negative invoice that can then be used in conjunction with other invoices to reduce the total balance due for the client, or reallocate it in a myriad of ways. Basically, a credit memo. And finally, increase the client's retainer. Move the funds into the client's retainer. Now, we're refunding a retainer, so we can't use that option. And actually, we can't use the on account option either. Why? Because that actually only applies to items themselves. So when refunding a retainer, you really only have two applicable choices: writing a check back or refunding the client's credit card. And in our case, we're writing a check back. The available retainer is conveniently listed for us. And now we can just enter in our refund amount. We even put a little note next to the refund amount field where it says enter a positive value. Don't worry about negatives or those types of things. Just enter in how much you want to refund. We'll handle all the negatives and that kind of stuff. So our client wants a full refund. So we'll pop in our 5793.02. And when we tab out of the field, notice our total refund in the bottom right, highlighted in red, is indicated for us. Today's date is just fine. Of course, you could change that. The fiscal month, that's going to determine where this transaction appears on your financial documents, etc. The transaction description defaults to credit memo, but that can be changed. Let's say we want to put in return retainer balance, something to that effect. And guess what? We're done. All we have to do now is click OK and let ProCloud do the hard part. You're always going to be warned before processing a return because there are a numerous amount of transactions that could be generated by this. So if you're ready to go, just click OK. If you want to cancel, just hit cancel, obviously. Click OK and we start processing. And just like that, ProCloud's done everything for us. It's alerting us that the credit refund has completed successfully. Would you like to go to the entry so we can write a check for it? Sure, why not? And we click yes. This gets us to the familiar payments and print checks window. And just like all of our other outstanding bills, here's an entry. For our client, it has that unique, what we call a one-time vendor code created for it. And we could just tag and print a check, as many of you are accustomed to, as soon as we're ready. This entry, of course, corresponds to an operating expense on our vendor invoices existing tab. And you can see we made an expense for our client used to generate that check. And moreover, there's another series of transactions that occurred on our cash receipts window existing tab. We can see here is our negative retainer. That's removing the funds from the client. And that's actually offset with a specialized miscellaneous cash receipt. That's basically keeping our cash in balance. Why? Because we eventually need to write a check. We can't just put a negative retainer in. We still have to reduce a check. We still have to write a check that's going to reduce our cash balance for us. So all of those fairly sophisticated transactions are done immediately and accurately for you, just like that. Could you do it all yourself? Sure, but why would you just use the returns and credits window to do so? Okay, retainers. Now let's switch over to the retainer's cousin, deposits. Unlike retainers, deposits are intricately tied to the items contained on the proposal to which the deposit is received. But in accounting concepts, the two transactions are nearly identical. However, deposits actually have additional mechanisms to change how they are allocated to the proposal items, and we often have questions on how to do so. First, and very commonly, if a deposit has been applied to a proposal and the client rejects an item at a later date, you can simply edit the proposal and remove the item or items, and ProCloud's going to redistribute that deposit, provided the items have not been invoiced, a scenario which we'll address shortly. So Design Manager can automatically reallocate those deposit funds to the remaining items. Let's see that in action. So now we'll jump over to our project tab and our proposals window, and we'll continue to focus on our timeless townhome. And let's take a look at proposal 4. So here we can see we've both requested and received deposit, and yet I can see that I have not yet invoiced any and further out, all of my deposit is still available. A perfect example for this scenario. Dig a little deeper on the proposal status window, and just by them all being listed in red, I know that none of them have been invoiced, and all of that deposit amount is still fully available. So let's imagine that the client wants to take both of the items except for the Italian brass coffee table. Very simple. To reflect that, all we have to do is edit proposal 4 by using the edit button and go down to our item, untag it. You can see the total price, sales tax, etc. are all automatically recalculated, and we click OK. Now I'm actually reprocessing or regenerating that proposal, and you can see that the total proposed amount and the corresponding requested deposit have decreased, as we would imagine. What didn't decrease is the amount received, and nor should it. That's what the client gave to us, and we have those funds. Beneath the scenes, if we go again deeper into our status, we can see now there are only the 2 items, the sofa and the chair, on the proposal as it exists. But if we look at the requested versus the received amounts, both of them now have an additional amount on the received. And what Design Manager did is it took the amount of deposit from the table and proportionally distributed to the other items. So the chair, being a higher priced item, got a little bit more of the extra deposit, while the sofa got a little bit less. So the funds are all there, they're just being allocated to the other items. So when we go to invoice these 2 items, the client's going to see that exact amount that he provided on proposal 4. And we can even see that in detail on our history. Notice that we have many iterations of our proposal, and then now we can see where we've changed it. So all of that's being recorded for us as well. Okay, great. And let's see, we can reprint, and we can see that our received deposit amount is exactly what it was, just only applied to those single 2 items, and we could provide this to documentation to the client. Now, I mentioned we can only do that if the item has not yet been invoiced to the client. If the item has been invoiced to the client already, that deposit is not only received, but it's applied. So how could we take it off of the proposal and lose the deposit that it got when it's already been used? Not to sound, a bit circular there, but that's exactly what's going on. So if we take a look at proposal 1, for example, we can see we've requested and received our deposit, but we've also invoiced and utilized that deposit as well. So if we attempt to do the same by editing and trying to remove the slate, for example, I will be indicated and alerted that the item cannot be removed from the proposal because that deposit has been used since it was on an invoice. I would then need to credit the invoice, and then I could take it off of the proposal, or some other mechanism we're going to explore shortly. But Design Manager is going to prevent you from getting into a situation that I just described. Okay. Also, as I mentioned, we saw how we could move the retainer to a payment on an invoice. The exact same thing can be done with a deposit. In this case, we put a negative deposit on the cash receipt window and a positive value elsewhere. Maybe it goes to retainer, or maybe it's used to pay an invoice. That process is the exact same, so I'm not going to go into those functionality again. You can move any money around between documents simply by using that cash receipt window, as we demonstrated with the retainer paying off invoice 10,025. Let's talk about actually refunding that deposit though. So just like the retainer, we can use our returns and credits window, as you would imagine. So let's jump over to our accounting tab, back to our returns and credits window, and let's go to our timeless townhome. Okay, so now let's imagine that, let's take a look here. Back in our proposal window, let's pick a proposal. Proposal 10, perfect example. Let's imagine that the client is going to, I don't know, request a refund on the table. They're going to take all of the other items, but they want to have those funds returned for the table itself. All others will still progress. Okay, we can easily do so. So on the returns and credits window, now we just select our project. What type? Let's imagine in this case that they're going to want it returned on their credit card. We are now refunding a particular deposit for an item. So we're going to leave our items grid up, but I like to keep my point of view as focused as possible. So when possible, I'm going to use the proposal or invoice number, as we shall see, filter, and I only want to focus on my items on proposal 10. Narrowing my scope. And here, one of the best things about the Pro Cloud returns and credits is I can easily refund the deposit on one item or all of them across any proposal if I wanted to. It's a very simple system to do so. So if I wanted to refund the entire deposit, sure, I could do so. Could tag them all. And you can see the entire refund being populated. Can use my tag selection again. Let's untag these guys, and you can see you could tag by location, etc. But we're only going to refund the table itself. So I can just tag or select it individually. I can see the amount of available deposit and my total amount to refund in the far right column indicated in red. Can make this a bit bigger. And as I select items, the total refund accumulates in the bottom right for me. Further from here, let's say I just want a little bit more research on the item itself. I can use my Edit Item button, as indicated by the pencil and the sofa. And that's going to jump me right to my item window in specifications so I can review and make sure everything is the way I want. And this is exactly the item that I want to refund. We have our item selected. Our date's fine. Fiscal month is fine. Credit memo. Let's again change our transaction description, something a bit more indicative of what happened. Refund table deposit. I can also, perhaps there was a restocking fee, or perhaps my terms with the client is the portion of the deposit is non-refundable. You can change that too. Now you would use the pencil edit button, where I can now change the amount of deposit to refund. So you aren't forced into refunding the entire deposit if need be. Design Manager is always going to give you the flexibility to change that. But in our case, we'll go ahead and refund the entire thing. And again, just like that, we're ready to go. Click OK. Get that warning. Make sure you're ready to process your refund. We are. So we click OK, and Design Manager does all the hard work. It's going to ask us, you selected to return that on the client's credit card. If I actually process this refund through my associated Stripe account, the client's credit card would actually appear right here. And I could select it, boom, it would shoot out right to Stripe as well. Again, another reason why the Stripe association is so convenient, but I could imagine that I process it on the Visa. Click OK, and all those transactions get done for us. Refund has completed successfully. Would you like to see the entry which represents the credit card refund? Sure. And there it is. And that represents the reduction in cash that's ultimately going to be refunded from our Visa account. What else occurred there? Well, we have our negative cash receipt on the proposal window. We can see our requested and received amounts are still the same. We did actually receive that amount, but we can see where we actually have our $38.67.50 as being refunded. in this case. We're tracking all of that stuff for us. All of the deposit available is for the other items because they're going to be invoiced, they've been approved. Okay. Very simple, very convenient. Really, the hard part there is just performing what the client is asking us to do. They want that refund back on their credit card for that item, for that amount. There we go. Let Design Manager do all the work. Okay, now we're moving on to our last section of the credits, and this is going to be when we have to credit anything that's been invoiced to the client. Today's cardinal rule, if we remember anything, let it be this. If the item or items have been invoiced to the client, you will be creating a credit invoice at some point. So since it progressed as far as the invoicing stage, we're going to have some sort of credit invoice or credit memo created to represent that refund to the client. Whether or not the item's been paid in full or deposited, received or not received, all that's got to be considered to a degree, but a credit memo will be created at all times. Now, let's take a peek at some examples here. Here's a very common scenario. Let's imagine jumping over to our invoice window. We have an invoice for our Atlanta office project. There's been no payments yet. The client receives it. Mr. Miller says, hey, I don't want one of the items. Okay, really no harm or no foul at that point. We could simply credit that invoice and create it again, excluding that one particular item. Done. No problem. Move forward. Very simple. So if an invoice is unpaid, you still have some flexibility in returning it. You'll always make that credit memo, as we saw before. That's the documentation for the client and the perfect audit log that you would ever need. Heaven forbid if there was some sort of sales tax audit or those types of things. The invoices being recorded and then reversed all have their own invoice number, which is a perfect transactional record of what occurred. Let's think of some more difficult scenarios though. Let's make a credit for a single item on a paid invoice. The client's paid for everything and we owe them some sort of compensation. They've returned the item, we're going to accept it back. Returns and credits is the ideal solution. Back on our returns and credits. In our case, let's take a look at that invoice. Let's pick invoice 10,058. We can see invoiced, deposit applied, net invoice, and paid in full. And if we look at that guy, we can see a few items. Everything paid is indicated by the paid stamp as well. Let's imagine that Mr. Miller wants to return, I don't know, how about the chocolate brown desk, reference number 3? Absolutely. Since this project is ongoing, maybe Mr. Miller wants to keep the credit on account so it can be used in future. Let's use that as an example. So over to our returns and credits, we're going to pop in our Atlanta office for Mr. Miller. What's our refund type? Well, he clearly said he would like that on account. Great, we can do that. This is going to be a refund for an item, in this case, an item that's been invoiced. And again, I'm going to use my invoice number filter to narrow everything down so I can focus just on a subset of items. Mr. Miller is returning our desk. Select it, and we've got our process already begun. We saw the day, we saw the fiscal month, transaction description, refund desk. Now, very frequently, there could be a restocking fee from your vendor, or perhaps you have terms where, I don't know, freight isn't returned or something along those lines. Just like we saw that you can change how much deposit you want refunded, you can change the credit amount to your client as well. Maybe there's a scenario where there's 4 chairs and they return 2. You can do all of it. Again, we're going to use our edit button as indicated by the pencil on the right side of our items grid. I'm gonna check the override. This is telling Design Manager, hey, I'm in control right now. I want to tell exactly the amounts to refund. And I'm gonna say freight's non-refundable just by zeroing out the price to invoice and taxable amount if necessary. And now notice our current refund is $1155.10. After our override, it's going to decrease proportionately based upon the reduction of the freight and the tax on the freight. So you're always in control of how much you want to refund as well. So back to that notion of having a clear idea of your ultimate goal, that's one of the concepts to think about. Get ready to go ahead and click OK, and we're going to process. Refund's been completed successfully. In this case, do you want to go see the credit invoice so you can view or print it? I sure do. And there we are. I said at the beginning of the invoices, if the client if the item's been through the invoice stage, you will be making a credit memo at some point, and there it is. This one was a bit of a manual credit invoice, and we can see the negative values there for it. Since there's a negative balance due there, that is the concept that it's been included on account. And of course, I could then print out or send a copy over to Mr. Miller for his records as well. And if there were multiple invoices for Mr. Miller, I may want to go to my accounts receivable reports and then print a statement. And I can see one of my outstanding invoices from last year, and I can see my credit. So he knows precisely what his current outstanding balance is, another documentation for him. And I could easily go ahead and then email the report to him or what have you. Statement, very handy in these type of scenarios, so the client knows exactly what's currently due. Great. Client returns and credits is perfect for the scenarios where the item has already been invoiced to the client. All of those transactions get done automatically for you, and they're always going to be fully accurate. Finally, another scenario that is encountered by our client experience team quite frequently is the concept of refunding a portion of an overall invoice or a portion of an overall project. We've seen scenarios where X amount of freight wants to get returned, or very commonly, a certain amount of design services are being refunded or just applied to the credit for the client for being such a great individual to work with, etc. How do we handle that? That's very simple. What I often suggest is that credit is a bit conceptual. So let's actually make a specification or an item that reflects that credit. So let's imagine for one of our projects, let's take the Timeless Townhome. We can see we have a multitude of time entries, and perhaps this project's been wonderful. Mrs. Hills has been fantastic to deal with. They want us to do their beach house or what have you, and we're going to say, hey, thank you for all of this. I'm going to give you a reduction on some of your design time. In that case, I could actually make a new item. Verbiage is whatever you would like. Have a credit for 2 hours of design services. Group. Let's put that location. Time as our location. Sales category. Let's use professional services. I could do -2 hours. And then in this case, I may just use a design fee component type. And I might even, let's say my rate is 40 an hour. I could put my 40 in, my -2. I'm coming up at a price to the client of a -$80. And we're good to go. So now I've created this concept of a credit, a free form credit, let's think of it. And again, I'm using design time as an example. It could be anything. And now I can go over to my invoicing. I'm gonna go to our timeless townhome. And we can jump down to our time entry. So all the way at the bottom, I can see our credit. I could make this by itself for a credit memo of $80, but more commonly I see is where it may be included with other time entries. Transaction description, design time with credit. Click OK. And now let's take a look. Let's just preview. I can easily see my credit for design services listed for me. So a very simple way of applying a free form credit to the project. Just make an item for it. Watch out for your sales tax and those types of things, but that's the easiest way to handle certain circumstances for, like, even if there's been some issues with shipping or damage on items, those types of things. Making an item for it is a very linear, simple, and clear way to convey that to the client. Okay. Now, with that brings us to our end of our fairly lengthy discussion on client returns and credits. Innately, client returns and credits tend to be a complicated yet integral part of the design business. So today I want to go through many common scenarios to show how you can both manually reflect the return, but repeatedly and reliably using that returns and credits window to process most of the common returns, really all of the common returns. And with that, I thank you all for joining the discussion today, and I really hope you attend another of our webinars in the near future. Take care, have a great day, and a happy new year.